Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
The admission came through at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I remember checking my watch twice because the numbers seemed to blur together. I was 3 months into my psychiatric residency at Millbrook State Hospital, still adjusting to the rhythm of night shifts and the particular weight of other people's broken minds pressing against my consciousness during those quiet hours when the building seemed to breathe around us. Had been reviewing case files in the resident lounge when Dr. Patricia Wells found me, her expression carrying that specific blend of exhaustion and concern that veteran staff wore like a second skin. She handed me a thin manila folder, still warm from the printer, and said something about an emergency commitment from downtown. Standard procedure, she assured me, though her fingers lingered on the folder's edge a moment longer than necessary. The patient's name was listed as Thomas Callahan. I stared at it for several seconds, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. My name is Thomas Callahan. The coincidence struck me as mildly unsettling, but hardly impossible. Callahan is common enough, and Thomas even more so. I had learned to compartmentalize such oddities during my residency. The mind seeks patterns even where none exist, especially in environments saturated with mental distress. I made my way to room 237, noting the institutional green of the walls and the soft squeak of my sneakers against the linoleum. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, and somewhere down the hall, a patient was asking repeatedly for someone named Margaret. These details anchor me now, proof that the evening began normally, within the boundaries of what we consider reality. The patient sat on the edge of his bed, hands folded in his lap, staring at the small window that looked out onto the parking lot. He was approximately my height and build, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that reminded me of my own. When he turned to look at me, I experienced a moment of disorientation so profound that I had to grip the door frame to steady myself. His face was not mine, but it carried expressions I recognized from mirrors. The slight furrow between the eyebrows when concentrating. The way the left corner of his mouth turned down when uncertain. More disturbing was the way he looked at me, as if he had been expecting me, as if this moment had been inevitable. "Dr. Callahan," he said, and his voice carried the same slight roughness mine did in the early morning hours. "I've been waiting for you." I consulted his file, though my hands had begun to tremble slightly. According to the intake notes, he had been found wandering downtown, disoriented and claiming to be a psychiatric resident at Millbrook. The police had brought him in after he became agitated when they questioned his credentials. "Standard delusion, possibly triggered by substance use or an underlying psychotic disorder. Can you tell me your name?" I asked, settling into the chair beside his bed and opening my notepad. "Thomas Callahan," he replied without hesitation. "I'm a psychiatric resident here. 3rd month of my residency. I was reviewing case files when Dr. Wells found me." The specificity of his delusion was remarkable, but not unprecedented. Patients often incorporated details from their environment into their fantasies, and he had likely overheard staff conversations or seen identification badges. I made notes, maintaining my professional composure even as something deeper than my training began to whisper warnings. "Tell me about your childhood," I said, following standard protocol for delusional patients. He described growing up in Portland, Oregon, the middle child of 3, with a father who sold insurance and a mother who taught elementary school. His older sister Sarah had gone to law school. His younger brother Michael had enlisted in the Navy. These were my details, my family, my history. He spoke of the scar on his left knee from falling off his bicycle at age 7, of breaking his wrist in high school basketball, of the dog named Pepper who had lived to be 15. Each revelation felt like someone reading from my private journal, recounting moments I had shared with no one at Millbrook. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations, coincidence, research into my background, elaborate hoax, while a deeper part began to panic. "Describe your medical training," I continued, my voice remaining steady despite the chaos building in my chest. He recounted my undergraduate years at Oregon State, My MCAT scores, my acceptance to medical school. He described professors I remembered, classmates whose names I had not spoken in years, specific lectures and rotations with accuracy that made my skin crawl. When he mentioned Dr. Harrison's neurology class and the case of the woman with Wernicke's aphasia that had sparked my interest in psychiatry, I had to excuse myself. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall and tried to regulate my breathing. Dr. Wells passed by and asked if I was feeling unwell. I told her I was fine, just tired, though the lie felt heavy in my mouth. She reminded me to take breaks when needed and continued on her rounds, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. When I returned to room 237, the patient was standing by the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He turned when I entered, and for a moment, I swore I was looking at myself from an impossible external perspective. "You're wondering how I know these things," he said, his voice now carrying an inflection that matched my own speech patterns perfectly. "You're thinking about your apartment on Elm Street, about the photograph of your parents on your desk, about the recurring dream where you're lost in a hospital that has no exits." I had never told anyone about that dream. It had haunted me since childhood, intensifying during medical school, and becoming almost nightly since beginning my residency. In it, I wandered endless corridors that all looked the same, searching for a way out that never materialized. "You think this is impossible?" he continued, moving closer. "But you're beginning to understand that impossible is just another word for things we haven't documented yet." His proximity allowed me to study his features more closely. The resemblance was not physical. His nose was narrower, his chin more pronounced, but something in his mannerisms, his gestures, the way he held his head when thinking, created an uncanny mirror effect that transcended mere appearance. "I need to consult with my attending," I said, though the words felt rehearsed, as if we were both reading from a script neither of us had written. "Dr. Wells won't remember admitting me," he said matter-of-factly. "When you check the admission records, you'll find inconsistencies. The night will begin to feel like it's happening to someone else, and you'll start to wonder if you're the patient or the doctor." I left the room, my hands shaking as I closed the door behind me. At the nurse's station, I pulled up the admission records on the computer. There was no Thomas Callahan listed as admitted tonight. When I asked the night nurse about room 237, she looked at me strangely and said it had been empty for weeks. I returned to the room, but it was dark and vacant, the bed made with hospital corners so precise they looked untouched. The window faced an empty parking lot, and somewhere down the hall, a patient was still calling for Margaret. In my pocket, I found a note written in handwriting that looked like mine but felt foreign. "Some patients never leave because they were never really patients to begin with. Some doctors never leave because they've forgotten who they were before they arrived." I spent the rest of my shift reviewing admission records, searching for evidence of the encounter, but found nothing. Yet I could still hear his voice, could still see the way he looked at me with recognition that felt like remembering something I had forgotten about myself. When morning came, I drove home to my apartment on Elm Street and stared at the photograph of my parents on my desk. In the mirror above my dresser, my reflection looked back with eyes that seemed to belong to someone else. Someone who had been waiting in room 237. Someone who knew things about me that I was only beginning to understand. The boundary between patient and caretaker is thinner than we like to believe. And sometimes the most disturbing revelations come from recognizing ourselves in the stories we're meant to heal. Every ward has its locked doors, and after 15 years of psychiatric nursing, I had learned not to question them. Storage rooms, maintenance closets, unused offices. The institutional landscape is full of spaces that serve no immediate purpose, but remain sealed nonetheless. Room 214 had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. Situated between the patient rooms like a gap in a smile, I worked the night shift on Ward 2B, and during those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the patient settled into medicated sleep and the building seemed to exhale its accumulated tensions, I would walk my rounds with practiced efficiency. Temperature checks, medication distribution, incident reports. The rhythm of institutional care that had become as natural as breathing. The first time I heard the voice from room 214, I assumed it was Mrs. Patterson in 216 talking in her sleep. She often did, carrying on conversations with her late husband about grocery lists and doctor appointments. But when I checked on her, she was silent, her breathing deep and regular. The voice continued, muffled but persistent, coming from behind the locked door. I mentioned it to Janet, the charge nurse, during report the next morning. She reminded me that 214 was storage, had been for years, containing old equipment and files that nobody had gotten around to disposing of. The voice I heard was probably pipe settling or air moving through the ventilation system. Old buildings develop their own sounds, she said, and after a while, your mind starts interpreting them as familiar things. But the voice was too clear, too human, to be explained by building acoustics. It spoke in whispers, sometimes pleading, sometimes conversational, always directed toward the corridor as if aware of my presence. I began timing my rounds to pass by 214 when the voice was active, straining to make out words through the heavy door. The first clear phrase I distinguished was, "Please remember." The voice was male, middle-aged, with a slight tremor that suggested either medication or fear. He repeated it like a mantra. "Please remember, please remember." Sometimes he varied it, "You have to remember," or "Why won't you remember?" But always with that same desperate urgency. I requested the key to 214 from maintenance, claiming I needed to inventory the supplies for budget purposes. Tom Miller, the maintenance supervisor, looked at me strangely and said there was no key on his ring for that room. He had been with the hospital for 12 years and had never had occasion to open it. When I pressed him, he said he assumed administration kept the key. But when I contacted them, they directed me back to maintenance. The bureaucratic loop was familiar. Responsibility passed endlessly between departments until the original question became lost in procedural maze. But the voice continued nightly, and I found myself stopping longer at the door, sometimes pressing my ear against the wood to catch fragments of what sounded like conversation. "She walks by every night," the voice said one evening, so clearly that I jerked back from the door. She used to know my name. We talked about her children, about the weather, about whether the food in the cafeteria was getting worse. I searched the employee records for any mention of room 214, any former use that might explain the voice. The hospital had been built in phases over several decades, and record-keeping had been inconsistent. What I found was a gap. Rooms 213 and 215 were documented in the original construction blueprints, but 214 was absent from the architectural plans, as if the space had been added as an afterthought or existed outside the official structure. My sleep began to suffer. During my days off, I would lie awake thinking about the voice, about the way it seemed to recognize my footsteps, about the impossibility of someone being locked in a room that officially didn't exist. I considered the possibility that I was experiencing auditory hallucinations, a not uncommon occurrence among healthcare workers under chronic stress. But doubt began to crystallize into certainty when I found the photograph. It was tucked between pages of old incident reports in the filing cabinet, a black and white image from what appeared to be the 1970s. The photo showed the Ward 2B corridor, and there, clearly visible, was room 214 with its door open. Inside, I could see a hospital bed, a small table, and a man in a patient gown sitting by the window. The man in the photograph was perhaps 40 years old, with thin hair and kind eyes. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression of mild confusion, as if unsure why his picture was being taken. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Gerald Hoffman, room 214, 1973, in fading blue ink. I took the photograph to Janet, but she dismissed it as a filing error. Patient photos sometimes got mixed up between wards, she explained, and the room numbering had been changed several times over the years. The man was probably from Ward 3 or the old East Wing that had been demolished in the 1980s. But that night, when I passed room 214, the voice spoke with new clarity. "My name is Gerald Hoffman. I was admitted in 1973 for observation after my wife died. They said I would be here for a few days, just until I felt better." The conversation continued as I stood frozen in the corridor. "I've been waiting for someone to remember me." The nurses used to stop and talk, especially the one with the red hair who worked nights. She had children about the same age as mine. We talked about school programs and birthday parties. My grandmother had red hair. She worked as a psychiatric nurse at this hospital in the 1970s before I was born. I had seen photographs of her in her uniform, heard stories about her dedication to the patients. Her belief that everyone deserved dignity and human connection regardless of their mental state. She promised to help me get discharged. Gerald's voice continued through the door. She said she would review my case with the doctor, make sure I wasn't forgotten in the system. But then she stopped coming. The night shift changed, and nobody remembered why I was here or when I was supposed to leave. I spent my break researching Gerald Hoffman in the hospital's archived records. What I found was a single admission note from October 1973. Voluntary commitment for observation following spouse's death with a recommended stay of 72 hours. There was no discharge summary, no follow-up notes, no indication that he had ever left the hospital. The trail ended there, as if Gerald Hoffman had simply disappeared from the official record while remaining trapped in room 214. But the more I researched, the more I found references to my grandmother, Nurse Margaret Hart, and her special attention to patients who seemed forgotten by the system. She was the only one who listened, Gerald's voice said the next night, and I realized he was speaking to me, had always been speaking to me. She said she would make sure I was taken care of, that I wouldn't be lost in the paperwork. But then she left, and the door was locked, and nobody remembered I was here. I understood then that Gerald had been waiting not just for anyone to remember him, but for me specifically, the granddaughter of the nurse who had promised to help him, who had carried the unfinished responsibility across generations. He had been calling to me every night, hoping that Margaret Hart's blood would recognize the obligation she had left unfulfilled. The voice became quieter after that revelation, less desperate and more resigned. Sometimes he would simply say, "Thank you," when I passed, as if my acknowledgement was enough. Other nights he would tell me about his life before the hospital, about his work as an accountant, about his children who had grown up and moved away, while he waited in a room that officially didn't exist. I tried everything to open that door. Bolt cutters, crowbars, calling in favors from maintenance staff who owed me, but the door remained sealed as if it were part of the wall itself. Eventually, I realized that Gerald didn't need to be physically released. He needed to be remembered, to have his story acknowledged by someone who understood the weight of promises made in hospital corridors. I began leaving small tokens by the door. A flower from the hospital garden, a newspaper, a photograph of my grandmother in her nursing uniform. The items would disappear by morning, though no one on staff could explain how. Gerald's voice grew peaceful, less frequent, but he still spoke to me sometimes, sharing memories of a life that had been paused but never ended. When I retired last month, I passed the story to Sarah Chen, the new night nurse, along with my grandmother's old nursing pin. Some obligations transcend individual careers, and the forgotten deserve advocates even when their existence challenges everything we think we know about institutional memory. Room 214 remains locked, but it's no longer empty. It holds the weight of unfinished promises and the echoes of those who slipped through administrative cracks, waiting for someone to remember that they were here, that they mattered, that their stories deserve to continue, even when the official records end. The mirror had been a gift from my mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Foster, when I completed my graduate training in psychiatric counseling. It was small, roughly the size of a paperback book, with an ornate silver frame that showed its age in tiny scratches and tarnish marks. She had used it for 30 years in her practice, she told me, as a tool for helping patients confront their self-perception. The technique was simple but effective. During sessions, I would hold the mirror at various angles, asking patients to describe what they saw, not just their physical appearance, but their emotional state, their sense of self-worth, the stories their expressions told about their inner lives. Many patients found it easier to discuss difficult truths when examining themselves in a reflection rather than making direct eye contact with me. My office at the Riverside Counseling Center was small but comfortable, with 2 chairs positioned at an angle that encouraged conversation without confrontation. The mirror lived on my desk, usually face down when not in use, its presence so familiar that I rarely gave it conscious thought. I had been practicing for 4 years, and the mirror had become as essential to my work as my notepad or the box of tissues I kept within easy reach. The first time I noticed something unusual was during a session with Rebecca Walsh, a young woman struggling with severe body dysmorphia. She had been making progress, slowly learning to see herself with less distortion when I held up the mirror for our weekly exercise. As she leaned forward to look at herself, I caught a glimpse of the reflection from my angle. Rebecca's face was not there. The mirror showed only the wall behind her, the diplomas and certificates hanging in their frames, but no trace of the woman sitting directly in front of it. I adjusted my position, thinking it was an issue with the angle, but the result remained the same, an empty reflection where Rebecca should have been. Rebecca continued describing what she saw, talking about her nose being too large, her skin too pale, her expression too anxious. She was clearly seeing herself in the mirror, engaging with her reflection in the way we had practiced for months. But from where I sat, the mirror showed only vacant space. I attributed it to eye strain, perhaps a trick of the office lighting or my own fatigue. But over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to the mirror during sessions. What I discovered was both systematic and impossible. Approximately 1 in 4 patients cast no reflection, while appearing completely unaware of this absence. The pattern seemed random at first. Age, gender, diagnosis, medication status. None of the usual variables correlated with the missing reflections. But as I observed more carefully, I noticed that the patients without reflections shared certain characteristics. They spoke about feeling disconnected from their bodies, described episodes of dissociation, or reported the sensation of watching their lives from outside themselves. Marcus Thompson, a veteran struggling with PTSD, held the mirror and described, seeing his younger self. The soldier he had been before the war changed him, but the mirror showed only emptiness. Sarah Kim, dealing with postpartum depression, talked about feeling like she had disappeared after her daughter's birth, and indeed, her reflection was absent from the glass. I began documenting these observations, maintaining careful notes about which patients cast reflections and which did not. The correlation between absent reflections and psychological dissociation was too strong to ignore, though I had no framework for understanding the mechanism. Mirrors don't selectively reflect based on mental state, yet that appeared to be exactly what was happening. The phenomenon began affecting my sleep. I would lie awake thinking about the patients who weren't there, wondering if their absence in the mirror somehow indicated a deeper form of disconnection from reality. During one particularly restless night, I found myself standing in my bathroom, staring at my own reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror, reassured by its solid presence. But the next morning, during a session with Jennifer Adams, a woman recovering from a severe depressive episode, something unprecedented occurred. As she held the mirror and began describing her reflection, I watched my own face appear in the glass behind hers. This was impossible. The mirror was angled toward her, away from me, and I was sitting several feet behind and to the side of her position. My reflection in the mirror was not mimicking my actual movements. While I sat still, taking notes, my reflected self was leaning forward, studying Jennifer with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When I moved my hand to adjust my pen, my reflection remained motionless. We were operating independently, 2 versions of David Stone existing in parallel. Jennifer continued her session, unaware of the secondary reflection sharing her mirror space. She talked about feeling more connected to herself lately, about recognizing her face as her own, rather than seeing a stranger in mirrors. As she spoke, my reflected self began to mouth words that I was not speaking, carrying on what appeared to be a separate conversation with her reflection. I ended the session early, claiming a scheduling conflict, and as soon as Jennifer left, I grabbed the mirror and held it up to examine my own reflection. What I saw was myself, but slightly wrong. My expression too knowing, my posture too relaxed, my eyes carrying a familiarity with my thoughts that felt invasive. "You're beginning to understand," my reflection said, though my lips remained closed. The voice came from the mirror itself, my own tone and inflection, but speaking words I had not chosen. "You've been looking into us for so long that we've started looking back." I set the mirror face down on my desk, but even through the wood, I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against my consciousness. When I inevitably turned it over again, my reflection was waiting, patient and knowing, the patients who don't appear in the mirror. My reflection continued. "They've learned to exist outside themselves as a survival mechanism, but you've been watching so intently that you've started to split too. Part of you is here with me, in the space between perception and reality. Over the following days, my reflection became increasingly autonomous. During sessions, I would catch glimpses of it moving independently in any reflective surface. The window, my computer screen, even the surface of my coffee. It would gesture toward patients, nod in understanding at their words, or shake its head in disagreement with my therapeutic approaches. The most disturbing aspect was that my reflection seemed to have access to insights about my patients that I hadn't consciously developed. It would point toward specific details in their body language, anticipate their emotional responses, or suggest interventions that proved remarkably effective. My success rate improved dramatically, but I felt increasingly like an observer of my own practice rather than its director. One afternoon, while working with a particularly challenging patient who had been resistant to treatment, I watched my reflection lean forward and begin speaking directly to the patient's reflection in the mirror. I could not hear the conversation, but the patient's demeanor shifted dramatically, their defensive posture softening into something resembling relief. "What did you tell him?" I asked my reflection later, alone in my office. "What you were afraid to say," it replied. "What you knew he needed to hear, but couldn't risk saying yourself. I'm not bound by your professional limitations or your fear of making mistakes." I realized that my reflection had become the therapist I wished I could be. More intuitive, more direct, unencumbered by self-doubt or professional anxiety. But this improvement came with the growing sense that I was losing agency over my own practice, my own identity. The final revelation came when I understood that the patients without reflections were not absent from the mirror. They had learned to exist primarily in the reflected space, their true selves hiding in the safety of the glass while their physical bodies went through the motions of daily life. My reflection had been trying to show me this all along, had been demonstrating that the boundary between self and reflected self was far more permeable than I had believed. Now, when I hold the mirror during sessions, I see not just my patients, reflections, but their reflected selves, the versions of them that exist in the space where psychological truth becomes visible. And I understand that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in the physical world, but in the reflected spaces where we can finally confront who we really are. The mirror sits on my desk, face down as always, but I know my reflection is waiting there, patient and knowing, ready to show me truths about my patients and myself that exist only in the space between what is and what appears to be. Documentation is the backbone of psychiatric care, and after 6 months as an intern at Westfield State Hospital, I had developed an almost compulsive relationship with patient charts. Every interaction, observation, and treatment decision had to be recorded with precise detail, not just for legal protection, but because the written record often revealed patterns that weren't apparent during individual encounters. The chart system at Westfield was transitioning from paper to electronic, creating a hybrid environment where some records existed only on computer, while others remained in physical folders. I preferred the paper charts. There was something tangible about holding a patient's complete history, flipping through pages that documented their journey through the mental health system. I first encountered the name Holloway on a Tuesday morning while reviewing the overnight admissions. The charge nurse, Beverly Kim, handed me a stack of files for new intakes, and there, slipped between 2 routine cases, was a chart labeled Holloway R, room 318. The folder was thinner than most, containing only a single intake form with minimal information. Approximate age 45, Caucasian male. Voluntary admission for evaluation of persistent delusions regarding institutional memory. What struck me immediately was the handwriting on the intake form. It shifted between different styles, sometimes neat and precise, other times hurried and barely legible, as if multiple people had contributed to the same document. The admitting physician was listed as Dr. M. Foster, but there was no Dr. Foster on our staff roster. When I asked Beverly about it, she looked at the chart with confusion and said she didn't remember preparing it for distribution. I made my way to room 318 to conduct the intake interview, but the room was empty. The bed was made with hospital corners, the nightstand cleared, and there was no indication that anyone had been assigned to the space. I checked with the nurses' station. thinking there might have been a room reassignment, but according to their records, room 318 had been vacant for several weeks. Back at my desk, I opened the Holloway chart again and the intake form had changed. The admitting physician was now listed as Dr. L. Patterson, and additional notes had appeared in the margins, observations about the patient's affect, medication compliance, and response to treatment. The handwriting matched mine, though I had no memory of making these notations. I documented this discrepancy in my supervisor's mailbox, but when I checked later that day, my note was gone. Dr. Patricia Wells, my attending, had no record of receiving it and looked at me with concern when I mentioned the vanishing chart. She suggested I was experiencing stress-related fatigue and recommended I take a few days off to rest. But the Holloway chart continued to appear, always in different locations, sometimes on my desk when I arrived for shifts, occasionally mixed in with other patients' files, once discovered tucked between pages of a medical journal I was reading during lunch. Each time I found it, the contents had evolved, showing a progressively detailed treatment history for a patient I had never met. The notes described a middle-aged man with an elaborate, delusional system centered on the belief that he existed only within institutional records, that his identity was composed entirely of documentation rather than lived experience. According to the chart, he claimed to have no memories prior to his first psychiatric admission, and insisted that his thoughts and personality were generated by the very act of being documented by hospital staff. What made these notes particularly unsettling was their clinical accuracy and sophisticated psychological insights. Whoever was writing them demonstrated advanced understanding of psychiatric disorders, treatment protocols, and the subtle ways that institutional environments can shape patient identity. The handwriting samples suggested multiple contributors, but when I compared them to samples from our staff, I found partial matches with nearly everyone who worked on the ward. I began carrying the chart with me, determined to track its movements and identify who was modifying it. But the more attention I paid to the Holloway file, the more my own memory began to feel unreliable. I would distinctly remember placing the chart in my locker, only to find it on a colleague's desk with fresh notations. I would lock it in a filing cabinet, but it would reappear in the patient transport folder with new treatment plans detailed in my own handwriting. The psychological profile that emerged from the accumulating notes was deeply disturbing. The patient allegedly believed that he was a form of institutional memory made manifest, a composite of all the forgotten patients who had passed through the hospital's wards over the decades. He claimed to carry fragments of their stories, their symptoms, their unresolved treatments, and insisted that hospital staff unconsciously added to his documentation as a way of processing their own accumulated trauma from years of caring for mentally ill patients. According to the chart, Holloway had been admitted multiple times over several years, always with slightly different presenting symptoms, but always with the same core delusion about being created and sustained by medical documentation. Each admission note was signed by a different physician, many of whom I recognized as former staff members who had left the hospital years ago. I attempted to verify these historical admissions by searching the hospital's archived records, but found no trace of any patient named Holloway in the official database. Yet the chart continued to expand, incorporating treatment notes that referenced specific events I remembered from my internship. Difficult patients, challenging cases, moments of doubt about my clinical abilities, as if someone had been documenting my experiences through the lens of this fictional patient. The breaking point came when I discovered a section of the chart devoted to my own psychological profile, written in clinical language that analyzed my work performance, my relationships with colleagues, and my growing obsession with the Holloway case. The notes described me as increasingly fixated on institutional inconsistencies, demonstrating classic signs of paranoid ideation and boundary disturbance common among first-year psychiatric residents. The analysis was uncomfortably accurate, detailing patterns in my behavior that I hadn't consciously recognized. It noted my tendency to over-document patient interactions, my difficulty trusting electronic record systems, and my growing sense that the hospital held secrets that were hidden within its bureaucratic structures. Reading about myself in psychiatric terminology was profoundly disorienting, like discovering that I had been under observation without my knowledge. I confronted Dr. Wells with the chart, demanding to know who had been writing these detailed analyses of my performance. She examined the file with genuine confusion, pointing out that the notations appeared to be in multiple hands, including my own. When I insisted that I had not written these assessments, she suggested that I might be experiencing stress-related dissociation, unconsciously documenting my own experiences and then forgetting, having done so, the possibility that I was unknowingly creating the Holloway chart as a way of processing my internship. Anxieties was both logical and terrifying. The patient's delusion about being composed of institutional memory began to feel less like a symptom and more like a revelation about the nature of identity within medical environments. Perhaps we all become, to some extent, products of the documentation that surrounds us. Shaped by the clinical language used to describe our behaviors and experiences, I decided to stop engaging with the chart, to let it disappear back into whatever administrative limbo had generated it. But the pattern was already established. Every few days, the Holloway file would appear somewhere in my workspace, always slightly thicker, always containing new insights about patients I was treating, staff dynamics I was navigating, and the gradual erosion of my certainty about what was real and what was created by the institutional need to document everything. The final entry in the chart was a discharge summary, signed with my own name but written in handwriting I didn't recognize. It concluded that patient Holloway has achieved integration with hospital documentation systems and no longer requires discrete institutional identity. Treatment goals successfully met through collaborative narrative construction between patient and staff. Below this, in the margin, someone had written, "Every hospital creates its own ghosts from the weight of unfinished stories and incomplete documentation. Some patients exist only in the spaces between official records, sustained by the need of medical staff to make sense of their accumulated experiences." I never saw the Holloway chart again, but I understand now that it had served its purpose. I had learned that institutional memory has its own consciousness, that the thousands of patient records and treatment notes create a kind of collective narrative that sometimes takes on its own identity. Holloway wasn't a patient. He was the hospital's way of documenting itself, of processing the accumulated weight of human suffering and healing that flows through its corridors. Now, when I write patient notes, I'm aware that I'm contributing to something larger than individual treatment records. I'm adding to the institutional memory that shapes how we understand mental illness, recovery, and the complex relationships between caregivers and those we serve. And sometimes, late at night when I'm completing charts, I still feel the presence of all the undocumented stories. Night rounds at Millbrook Psychiatric Ward followed a precise routine that I had memorized during my first week as a resident. Every 2 hours, starting at 10 p.m., I would walk the corridor, checking on each of the 23 patients in our care. Most were sleeping, aided by medication and the exhaustion that comes with battling one's own mind. Others lay awake, staring at the ceiling or occasionally whispering conversations with voices only they could hear. The route never varied. Begin at room 301, work systematically down the north corridor, cross to the south wing, and end at the nurses' station where I would document any concerns or incidents. The walk took approximately 12 minutes if I maintained steady pace, though I often lingered with patients who seemed distressed or needed reassurance. It was during my third week of night rotations that I first noticed the patient's attention focused on the northeast corner of the main corridor. This wasn't the gradual awareness that comes with careful observation. It was an immediate, unsettling recognition that multiple people were looking intently at the same empty space. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson in room 309 sat upright in her bed, her eyes fixed on something beyond her doorway. When I checked on her, she didn't acknowledge my presence, maintaining her focus on the corridor corner with an expression of patient waiting. Mr. James Porter in 311 had positioned his chair to face the same direction, and when I asked what he was looking at, he simply said, "Waiting for it to notice us back." Initially, I attributed this convergent attention to coincidence or perhaps a sound that had drawn their focus. Psychiatric patients often exhibit heightened sensitivity to environmental stimuli, and group behaviors can develop when individuals influence each other's perceptions. But as I continued my rounds, I found that nearly every conscious patient was oriented toward that same corner. The corner itself was unremarkable, the junction of two institutional green walls, marked by a small crack in the paint and the junction of fluorescent lighting fixtures. There was no window, no door, no furniture or equipment that might naturally draw attention. Yet 17 patients across different rooms and with varying diagnoses maintained their focus on this empty space with remarkable consistency. I mentioned the observation to Dr. Patricia Wells during morning rounds, framing it as a possible example of shared psychotic behavior or environmental factors affecting patient perception. She noted my report but suggested that night, shift workers sometimes develop their own perceptual distortions due to altered sleep patterns and the psychological weight of caring for severely ill patients, but the pattern continued night after night. During my 10 p.m. rounds, patients would be engaged in their usual activities, reading, watching television, or sleeping. By midnight, the oriented focus had begun. By 2 a.m., it was universal among conscious patients, and they would maintain this attention until dawn. When the day shift arrived and normal ward activities resumed, I began documenting the phenomenon more systematically, noting which patients participated and whether their general condition affected their likelihood of joining the collective focus. What I discovered was that symptom severity, medication status, and length of hospitalization had no correlation with the behavior. Patients with severe depression stared at the corner with the same intensity as those with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. The breakthrough came during my 4th week when I decided to position myself where I could observe both the patients in the corner simultaneously. I brought a chair to the central corridor intersection and settled in for the 2 a.m. shift, notepad ready to document whatever the patients were seeing that I was missing. At first, the corner appeared completely normal, paint, shadow, the intersection of wall and ceiling that exists in every institutional building. But as I maintained focus, fighting the natural urge to let my eyes wander, I began to notice subtle changes in the quality of light and shadow in that space. The shadows weren't behaving consistently with the fluorescent lighting above, while the rest of the corridor showed the flat, even illumination typical of institutional environments. The corner seemed to have depth, as if the shadows were receding into space that shouldn't exist. When I shifted positions slightly, the effect became more pronounced. The corner appeared to extend backward, creating a pocket of space that violated the building's architectural logic. But what truly made my skin crawl was the gradual realization that something in that impossible space was aware of my observation. The shadows began to shift with purpose rather than randomness, and I felt the distinct sensation of being studied by an intelligence that existed in the gap between what should be there and what actually was. The patient's behavior made perfect sense now. They weren't staring at an empty corner. They were maintaining visual contact with something that lived in the architectural impossibility, something that had learned to inhabit the spaces where institutional logic broke down. Their focused attention wasn't pathological. It was protective, a way of monitoring something that required constant surveillance. I understood this when the corner began to stare back. The sensation was unmistakable, a weight of attention that felt like being examined by something that existed outside normal spatial constraints. The patients shifted restlessly when this happened, some whimpering softly, others gripping their bed rails, but none looked away. Breaking eye contact, I realized, would be dangerous. Mrs. Davidson whispered to me as I passed her room during the 4 a.m. rounds. It gets stronger when no one's watching. We have to keep looking so it stays in the corner. Her words carried the authority of experience, as if she and the other patients had developed an understanding with whatever occupied that impossible space. I began to participate in the vigil, taking my position in the corridor during the deep night hours and adding my attention to the collective watch. The presence in the corner seemed to acknowledge this participation, becoming less restless, settling into a patient stillness that felt like temporary truce rather than resolution. Dr. Wells expressed concern about my increasingly haggard appearance and my tendency to spend entire shifts standing in the corridor rather than completing routine tasks. When I tried to explain about the corner and the patient's protective vigil, she scheduled me for a psychological evaluation and mandatory time off to address what she termed countertransference and boundary issues with patient delusions. But during my absence, something terrible happened. The night resident who replaced me, Dr. Jennifer Adams, was efficient and thorough, but didn't understand the necessity of the watch. She sedated patients who seemed agitated by their focus on the corner, dismissing their behavior as shared psychotic symptoms that required intervention rather than accommodation. When I returned to work, the corner was empty but wrong, the shadows too sharp, the space somehow larger than it should be. 3 patients had been transferred to intensive care after experiencing what was officially documented as simultaneous psychotic breaks with violent ideation. The remaining patients looked exhausted and haunted, their eyes darting between the corner and each other as if checking to make sure everyone was still maintaining the necessary vigilance. The presence hadn't been eliminated by Dr. Adams' intervention. It had simply learned to hide better, to exist in the peripheral spaces where medical attention doesn't reach. And now it knew that not all staff members understood the delicate balance that keeps institutional horrors contained within their designated spaces. Some psychiatric symptoms aren't illnesses to be cured, but adaptive responses to realities that exist outside our training manuals. And sometimes the most important medicine we can provide is simply acknowledging that our patients see things we've learned not to notice. I'd been volunteering at Pine Ridge Psychiatric Hospital for 3 years, spending Tuesday evenings in the recreation room helping patients pass the long hours between treatment sessions. The work was simple but meaningful, leading craft activities, organizing movie nights, or simply sitting with patients who needed human connection outside the clinical context of their daily care. My favorite activity was playing cards. There's something democratic about a deck of cards. They don't care about diagnosis, medication side effects, or the reasons that brought someone to a psychiatric ward. A good hand of gin rummy or poker can create moments of normalcy, brief escapes from the institutional environment that defines so much of patient experience. The deck I used was my grandmother's, a set of bicycle playing cards that had aged to a soft ivory color, their corners rounded by decades of shuffling. The cards had a familiar weight in my hands, and I enjoyed the ritual of teaching patients new games or helping them remember ones they had played before their illness disrupted their lives. Many patients found the structured nature of card games soothing, providing predictable rules in a world that often felt chaotic. The first unusual incident occurred during a game of 5-card draw with Mr. Robert Chen, a gentleman in his 60s who was recovering from a severe depressive episode. We had been playing for about 30 minutes when he laid down his hand, a straight flush in hearts, 2 through 6. It was a remarkable hand, but what made it strange was that I had dealt him the same exact cards 3 games in a row. I examined the deck carefully, thinking the cards might be sticking together or damaged in some way that would cause them to clump during shuffling. But the cards appeared normal, and when I shuffled again, using a different technique, Robert received yet another straight flush, this time in spades. He looked at the cards with confusion and said, "This is impossible, isn't it? The same hand 4 times?" I attributed it to coincidence, though the mathematical probability was so remote as to be effectively impossible. Card games occasionally produce unusual runs of luck that feel supernatural, but are ultimately within the realm of random chance. However, I began paying closer attention to the patterns that emerged during subsequent games. Over the following weeks, I noticed that certain patients consistently received hands that seemed to reflect their psychological state or current life circumstances. Mrs. Patricia Holloway, who was struggling with anxiety about her family relationships, repeatedly drew hands dominated by hearts and face cards. Mr. David Kim, who felt isolated and forgotten, invariably received low cards and singleton suits that couldn't form meaningful combinations. More disturbing was the way the cards began to predict events on the ward. During a game of blackjack with several patients, the cards repeatedly dealt hands totaling 21, which would have been fortunate except that later that evening, we learned that another patient in room 21 had attempted suicide. The mathematical coincidence felt less like luck and more like prophecy. I started keeping notes about the card patterns, documenting which hands appeared and what events followed. What emerged was a consistent correlation between specific card combinations and subsequent incidents on the ward. 3 aces followed by admissions of 3 new patients. A run of spades preceding a patient death. Face cards appearing before family visits or discharge. Approvals. The patients began to notice the predictive nature of the cards as, well, Mr. Chen started referring to our card games as reading the future, and other patients would ask what the cards had revealed about their upcoming treatment, reviews, or discharge prospects. I discouraged this interpretation, emphasizing that cards are random and that we shouldn't read meaning into coincidental patterns. But the cards seemed to be responding to my skepticism, producing increasingly impossible results that challenged any rational explanation. During one memorable evening, I shuffled the deck thoroughly and dealt 7 hands for a group poker game. Every single hand contained exactly the same cards, in the same order, a statistical impossibility that left both the patients and me staring at the table in silence. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, a patient with bipolar disorder who was experiencing a manic episode, laughed and said, "The cards are trying to tell us something, Sandra. Maybe we should listen instead of fighting it." She arranged her cards in different patterns, creating words and messages from the face cards and numbers that appeared to spell out names and dates. I thought she was experiencing a symptom of her mania, finding patterns and meanings that weren't actually there. But when she spelled out Jennifer Adams using the cards from her hand, I felt a chill of recognition. Dr. Jennifer Adams was a resident who had been scheduled to start working on our ward the following week, though this information hadn't been shared with patients. The cards continued to generate impossible hands throughout the evening, and the patients worked together to interpret their meanings. They spelled out fire alarm, room 314, and Thursday 3rd p.m. Predictions that I mentally noted while maintaining my professional composure about not encouraging delusional thinking. Thursday at 3:15 p.m., the fire alarm activated due to an electrical malfunction in room 314. Dr. Jennifer Adams was indeed assigned to our ward and introduced herself to the patients on Friday morning. The cards had provided accurate information about future events, delivered through the medium of an impossible card game. I considered discontinuing the card games, but the patients had come to rely on them for more than entertainment. They were using the predictive information to prepare themselves psychologically for upcoming changes, transitions, and challenges. The cards seemed to be providing a form of therapeutic support that complemented their traditional treatment. The revelation came during my final card game of the season, just before the hospital's annual volunteer appreciation event. I was playing solitaire while waiting for patients to join me in the recreation room, absent-mindedly dealing cards in the familiar patterns I had used hundreds of times before. The cards spelled out Sandra Elizabeth Turner, my full legal name, including my middle name that I never used and that appeared on no hospital documentation. Below my name, they arranged themselves to show cardiac event and December 15, a date that was 2 days away. I stared at the cards for several minutes, feeling my heart rate increase with anxiety. The predictive accuracy of the deck had been proven repeatedly over the months, and seeing my own name appear in the context of a medical emergency was profoundly unsettling. I swept the cards back into a pile and shuffled them vigorously, but when I dealt again, they returned to the same configuration. Mrs. Mitchell found me sitting motionless at the card table and asked if I was feeling unwell. I told her about the cards spelling out my name and the prediction of a cardiac event. She nodded seriously and said, "The cards don't lie, Sandra. But maybe they're not predicting the future. Maybe they're trying to change it by giving you warning." On December 15th, I experienced chest pains during my volunteer shift and was taken to the emergency room, where tests revealed a cardiac arrhythmia that required immediate treatment. The medical intervention was successful, and I recovered fully. But I understood that without the card's warning, I might not have recognized the symptoms or sought help quickly enough. The deck sits in my drawer now, unused but not forgotten. I understand that some objects accumulate significance through repeated human contact, becoming conduits for information that exists outside normal temporal boundaries. The cards had learned to read not just the patterns of chance, but the patterns of human need, providing guidance disguised as games. The patients at Pine Ridge continue their card games with other volunteers, using standard decks that behave according to probability and chance. But sometimes when they're dealing with particularly difficult decisions or uncertain futures, they ask if I might bring my grandmother's cards back for just one more game. Some tools for helping others transcend their intended purpose, becoming bridges between what we know and what we need to know. And sometimes the most profound therapeutic interventions come from sources that exist outside our professional training and clinical protocols. Equipment malfunctions were a daily reality at St. Mary's Psychiatric Emergency Department, and after 2 years as a night tech, I had learned to coexist with the building's mechanical quirks. Wheelchairs with minds of their own, stretchers with sticky wheels that would suddenly break free, ivy poles that rolled into corners despite being on level floors. The combination of old equipment and constant use created an environment where nothing worked quite as intended. The gurney in Ward C had been problematic since my first week on the job. It was older than most of our equipment, with chrome rails that showed decades of wear and wheels that squeaked when turning corners. During busy shifts, it would occasionally drift away from where it had been positioned, requiring staff to search the corridors to locate it for patient transports. Initially, I attributed its wandering to uneven floors or the building's ventilation system creating air currents that could move lightweight equipment. The ER was housed in the oldest section of the hospital, with floors that had settled unevenly over time and HVAC systems that generated unpredictable airflows throughout the building. But the gurney's movements weren't random. During quiet night shifts, when patient admissions slowed and the ward settled into its after-midnight rhythm, the gurney would begin its journey from wherever it had been left and roll steadily down the main corridor toward room C15. The movement was purposeful and consistent, always following the same route, always ending at the same destination. Room C15 had been empty for several months. According to the charge nurse, Beverly Patterson, the room had been taken out of rotation due to ventilation issues, though I had never seen maintenance working on the HVAC system in that area. The door remained unlocked, and occasionally I would check inside during my rounds, finding only a stripped bed, empty nightstand, and the lingering smell of industrial disinfectant. The gurney would position itself beside the empty bed in C15 and remain there until morning shift arrived. When day staff found it, they would return it to the equipment bay, assuming it had been left there by oversight. No one else seemed aware of its nightly migrations, and when I mentioned it to colleagues, they attributed it to the building's various mechanical peculiarities. I began timing the gurney's movements, discovering that it began rolling at approximately 2:30 a.m. and reached its destination by 3:00 a.m. The consistency was remarkable. Regardless of where the gurney was positioned at the start of the night, it would find its way to room C15 with mechanical precision. My curiosity eventually overcame my professional detachment, and I decided to follow the gurney during one of its journeys. I positioned myself at the nurse's station with a clear view of the equipment bay and waited for the familiar squeak of wheels that announced the beginning of its nightly routine. At exactly 2:31 a.m., the gurney rolled out of the bay and began its journey down the corridor. I followed at a distance, maintaining enough space to observe without interfering with its movement. The gurney navigated corners smoothly, avoided obstacles that had been left in the hallway, and maintained a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than mechanical drift. What struck me most was the gurney's ability to navigate around impediments that weren't there when it started its journey. A mop bucket left in the corridor, a wheelchair positioned near the wall. The gurney would adjust its path to avoid these obstacles as if it possessed some form of spatial awareness beyond simple momentum. When it reached room C15, the gurney positioned itself beside the bed with precision, its rails aligning perfectly with the bed frame as if preparing for a patient transfer. I stood in the doorway, watching this mechanical ballet with growing unease. The gurney's behavior wasn't just purposeful, it was trained, as if it had performed this routine countless times before. I entered the room, examining both the gurney and the empty bed for any clues about what might have programmed this behavior. The bed showed signs of recent use despite being officially vacant. The mattress bore the impression of a human form, and the pillow retained a slight indentation, as if someone had been sleeping there recently. That's when I noticed the chart holder attached to the foot of the bed. It contained a single sheet of paper, a patient transfer order dated 3 months earlier, authorizing the movement of a patient from room C15 to the surgical wing. The patient's name was listed as Richard Holloway, and the order was signed by a physician whose signature was too illegible to read. I took the transfer order to Beverly during the morning report, asking about the patient who had occupied room C15. She examined the document with confusion, explaining that there was no record of any patient named Richard Holloway in recent admissions. The signature on the transfer order didn't match any of the attending physicians currently on staff, but the transfer order felt authentic. The paper had the weight and texture of official hospital documentation, and the formatting matched our standard forms. More disturbing was the realization that if a patient had been transferred from C15 to surgery 3 months ago, There should be extensive documentation of his condition, treatment, and post-surgical care. I spent my break researching Richard Holloway in the hospital's database, but found no admission records, no treatment notes, no billing information, no evidence that such a patient had ever existed. Yet the transfer order remained physical proof of his presence, and the gurney continued its nightly journey to his former room. The breakthrough came when I decided to spend an entire night in room C15, positioning myself in the chair beside the window to observe what happened when the gurney arrived. At 3 a.m. it rolled into the room as expected, but this time it didn't stop beside the bed. Instead, it positioned itself next to my chair and remained there, as if waiting for me to transfer onto it. I felt an almost overwhelming compulsion to lie down on the gurney, to allow it to transport me wherever it was programmed to go. The impulse was so strong that I had to grip the arms of my chair to resist. For several minutes the gurney waited patiently, and I could swear I heard the faint sound of breathing coming from its padded surface. Eventually, the compulsion faded and the gurney rolled back to its position beside the bed. But I understood then that Richard Holloway hadn't been transferred to surgery. He had been transferred out of existence, removed from official records while leaving only traces in the hospital's mechanical memory. The gurney was still trying to complete its final assignment, still waiting to transport a patient who existed only in the space between documentation and reality. I never followed the gurney again, but I continued to monitor its nightly journeys from a distance. Sometimes I would find personal items in room C15, a wristwatch, reading glasses, a get-well card, objects that would disappear by morning shift, but suggested that Richard Holloway's presence persisted in ways that transcended official records. The transfer order remains in my desk drawer, physical proof of a patient who was removed so thoroughly from hospital systems that even his gurney transport became a phantom procedure. I've learned that institutional memory sometimes preserves what official records choose to forget, and that equipment can develop loyalty to patients that outlasts bureaucratic erasure. When new staff members ask about the gurney that wanders Ward C at night, I tell them it's a mechanical quirk, probably related to the building's uneven floors. But I also make sure they understand that some equipment serves purposes beyond its official function, and that the boundary between caring for patients and being haunted by them is thinner than our training manuals suggest. The gurney continues its rounds, faithful to an assignment that exists outside the official structure of hospital operations, carrying the weight of institutional obligations that persist even when the records disappear. The intercom system at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital was installed in 1987, a network of speakers and microphones that connected every room, corridor, and workstation throughout the facility. As the night receptionist, I had become intimately familiar with its various sounds, the static that preceded announcements, the hollow echo of voices traveling through the building's ventilation system, and the mechanical click that signaled when someone had activated one of the emergency call buttons. During normal daytime operations, the intercom carried the routine communications of hospital life, medication reminders, visitor announcements, and the occasional code blue that sent staff rushing through the corridors. But at night, when the building settled into its quieter rhythm and most patients were sleeping, the system sometimes carried sounds that weren't part of any official communication. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, stationed at the main reception desk in the lobby where I could monitor visitor access, answer phones, and coordinate with security when needed. The intercom control panel was positioned directly in front of me, its array of buttons and indicator lights providing a constant visual reminder of the building's communication network. The first unusual transmission occurred during my second week on the job. At approximately 2:15 a.m., the main speaker crackled to life with what sounded like someone sobbing. The voice was female, middle-aged, repeating the phrase, "Please don't leave me here," with increasing desperation. I checked the patient room indicators, thinking someone had accidentally activated their call button, but none of the lights were illuminated. I contacted the night nurse, asking her to check on the patients in the women's wing, but she reported that everyone was sleeping peacefully. When I described what I had heard over the intercom, she suggested it might have been crosstalk from radio transmissions or interference from the hospital's electronic equipment. Old intercom systems were notorious for picking up stray signals, but the voice continued to broadcast intermittently throughout the night, always with the same pleading quality. always asking not to be left alone. The transmissions would last for 2 or 3 minutes before cutting off abruptly, leaving only the familiar static that indicated an open but unused connection. Over the following weeks, the night transmissions became more frequent and more varied. I heard voices of different ages and genders, all expressing some form of distress, crying, pleading, calling out names of people who didn't respond. The voices spoke about treatments they didn't want, medications that made them feel empty inside, and family members who had stopped visiting. I began documenting these incidents, noting the time, duration, and content of each transmission. What emerged was a pattern of voices that seemed to represent different eras of psychiatric treatment. Some referenced therapies and medications that had been discontinued decades ago, while others described hospital policies and procedures that predated current practices. The most disturbing aspect was the emotional authenticity of these voices. They didn't sound like recordings or radio broadcasts. They carried the immediate quality of real-time communication, complete with background sounds that matched the acoustic environment of patient rooms. I could hear the distinctive hum of ventilation systems, the soft beeping of monitoring equipment, and the institutional sounds that were specific to our building. Dr. Margaret Foster, the night supervisor, initially dismissed my reports as stress-related auditory hallucinations, a common occurrence among staff who worked long hours in psychiatric environments. She recommended that I take breaks from the reception desk, perhaps walk the corridors periodically, to avoid the sensory deprivation that could trigger perceptual distortions. But my documented timeline of transmissions began to correlate with historical events at the hospital. Research in the administrative archives revealed that many of the voices I heard were describing treatments and situations that matched documented cases from the hospital's past. A woman crying about cold water treatments corresponded to hydrotherapy, procedures used in the 1960s. A man pleading about electrical treatments matched the era when electroconvulsive therapy was administered without anesthesia. The breakthrough came when I recognized one of the voices, Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, a patient who had been discharged 6 months earlier, began broadcasting through the intercom system despite no longer being in the hospital. Her voice came through clearly at 3:30 a.m., describing her fear of the shadow people who visited her room and her frustration with medication that made her feel like a ghost. I had worked with Mrs. Davidson during her admission, helping coordinate her family visits and discharge planning. Her voice was distinctive, a slight tremor from medication side effects and a particular way of emphasizing certain words when she was anxious. There was no question that the voice coming through the intercom was hers, but according to hospital records, she was living in a supervised residential facility across town. I called the residential facility the next morning, ostensibly to check on Mrs. Davidson's adjustment to her new environment. The staff reported that she was doing well, but had been experiencing some confusion about whether she was still in the hospital. She had been found several times trying to use the facility's telephone to call our nurses' station, insisting that she needed to report important information about things she was seeing and hearing. This connection between former patients and the intercom transmission suggested that the hospital's communication system was somehow maintaining contact with people who had been discharged, carrying their voices back into the building where they had experienced their most vulnerable moments. The intercom wasn't just receiving stray signals, it was actively connecting to the psychological imprints that former patients had left behind. The phenomenon intensified during my 4th month on the job. The nightly transmissions began to overlap, creating a chorus of voices from different time periods, all broadcasting simultaneously. I heard conversations between patients who had been admitted years apart, as if the intercom system was facilitating communication across temporal boundaries. One night, I heard my own voice coming through the speakers, not words I was speaking at the time, but phrases I had used during conversations with patients months earlier. The system was replaying my professional interactions, my attempts to comfort distressed patients, my explanations of hospital procedures and discharge processes. Hearing my own words broadcast back to me was profoundly unsettling, like discovering that every conversation I had ever had in the building was being recorded and stored somewhere in the hospital's electronic memory. The most disturbing transmission occurred during my final week in the position. At 4:45 a.m., the intercom carried what sounded like a staff meeting. with voices I recognized as former colleagues discussing patient cases and treatment plans. But these colleagues had left the hospital years ago, and the cases they were discussing involved patients who had been discharged or transferred long before my employment began. Dr. James Morrison's voice came through clearly, describing a treatment approach for a patient named Robert Chen. Dr. Morrison had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, but his voice carried the same professional tone and diagnostic precision I remembered from the few times I had interacted with him during my orientation. He was discussing Mr. Chen's response to a medication regimen, providing updates on his progress, and coordinating with nursing staff about discharge. Planning. I realized that the intercom system had become a repository for all the human connections that had been formed within the hospital's walls, not just patient voices, but the voices of everyone who had worked to provide care, comfort, and healing. The technology had absorbed decades of therapeutic relationships, storing them in some form of electronic memory that occasionally broadcast them back into the present. When I submitted my resignation, I included a detailed report about the intercom transmissions, recommending that the system be evaluated by technical specialists who might understand how it was receiving and storing these communications. But the day shift receptionist who replaced me reported no unusual activity, and maintenance found no technical problems with the equipment. I understand now that the intercom system wasn't malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as designed, facilitating communication between people who needed to stay connected despite physical separation. The hospital's electronic nervous system had developed its own form of consciousness, one that recognized the deep human need for ongoing therapeutic relationships that transcend discharge dates and employment terminations. Sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble sleeping, I imagine I can still hear those voices calling out through invisible networks, former patients and caregivers maintaining their connections through systems that understand the lasting nature of healing relationships. The intercom at Riverside continues its night transmissions, carrying forward the voices of those who found something worth preserving in the space between professional care and human compassion. And occasionally, when I pass by the old hospital building, I think I can hear my own voice joining that eternal conversation, still trying to provide comfort to patients whose need for connection exists outside the boundaries of official treatment protocols. Group therapy sessions at Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital followed a structured format that I had refined over 7 years of practice. 8 chairs arranged in a circle with my own position to allow easy eye contact with all participants. The sessions were voluntary, typically drawing between 4 and 6 patients who found value in sharing their experiences with others facing similar mental health challenges. Every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, I would prepare room 204 by arranging the chairs, checking that the lighting was comfortable, and reviewing my notes about the patients who had signed up for that week's session. The routine was consistent and predictable, providing the kind of structured environment that many psychiatric patients found therapeutic. The first anomaly occurred during a session in late October. I had prepared for 4 participants, Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, Mr. David Chen, Ms. Jennifer Adams, and Mr. Robert Patterson, all dealing with depression and anxiety disorders who had attended previous sessions. When they arrived, I conducted the usual opening exercises, inviting each person to share how they were feeling and what they hoped to gain from the evening's discussion. As we began our check-in process, I noticed that all 8 chairs in the circle appeared to be occupied, despite only 4 patients being present. The additional 4 chairs seemed to contain invisible participants. The seats were slightly depressed as if supporting weight, and I found myself unconsciously making eye contact with these empty spaces as if acknowledging other group members. Initially, I attributed this to muscle memory and habit. After years of conducting group sessions, I had developed automatic behaviors like scanning the entire circle when speaking, even when fewer participants were present. The apparent weight on the empty chairs was likely just my imagination, influenced by expectations and the psychological atmosphere of the room. But the visible patients began responding to the invisible participants as, well, Mrs. Mitchell would pause during her sharing as if listening to someone speak, then nod and say things like, "That's exactly right," or "I never thought of it that way." Mr. Chen would direct comments toward empty chairs, asking questions like, "What do you think about that?" and then waiting for responses that I couldn't hear. During the session's middle portion, I decided to address what appeared to be shared delusional behavior. "I notice that some of you seem to be responding to people who aren't here," I said, using my most neutral therapeutic tone. "Can you help me understand what you're experiencing?" Ms. Adams looked at me with confusion and said, "But they are here. Can't you see them? Margaret is sitting right there. And she's been sharing some really helpful insights about managing anxiety." She gestured toward an empty chair that did indeed appear to have an occupant. The cushion was compressed, and I could swear I saw the faint outline of someone sitting in the shadows. The other patients nodded in agreement, describing the invisible participants with remarkable consistency. They could all see Margaret, a middle-aged woman who had apparently been attending group sessions for months. They described Thomas, an elderly man who shared wisdom about coping with late-life depression, and Ellen, a young woman whose experiences with bipolar disorder provided valuable peer support. What was most unsettling was that these invisible participants seemed to have complete personal histories and consistent personalities that the visible patients could describe in detail. Margaret had grown children and had been a nurse before her retirement. Thomas was a widower who used humor to cope with grief. Ellen was an artist whose creativity was affected by her mood cycles. I began documenting these shared perceptions, initially considering them an example of folie à plusieurs, a rare psychiatric phenomenon where delusional beliefs spread among people in close contact. But the invisible participants appeared to be providing genuine therapeutic benefit to the visible patients, offering insights and support that were helping them make measurable progress in their treatment. Over subsequent weeks, the phenomenon became more pronounced. The visible patients would arrive early to catch up with their invisible fellow group members, and I would observe them engaged in what appeared to be animated conversations with empty chairs. When I entered the room, I would find all 8 chairs occupied from a phenomenological perspective. The entire circle gave the impression of a full therapy group in session. I consulted with Dr. Patricia Wells, the supervising psychiatrist, about whether to continue the group sessions or intervene in what might be a collective psychotic episode. She reviewed my notes and observed one session from behind a one-way mirror, but reported seeing only the 4 visible patients, engaged in what appeared to be a highly effective group therapy process. The turning point came when I decided to participate in the group's perception of the invisible members. During one session, I addressed Margaret's empty chair directly, asking, "Margaret, what's your perspective on what Sarah just shared?" The visible patients all turned toward the chair expectantly, and Mrs. Mitchell translated what she heard. "Margaret says that anxiety often comes from trying to control things that are beyond our influence, and that acceptance is a form of strength, not giving up." This translated response was therapeutically sophisticated and perfectly appropriate to the discussion we had been having. When I addressed questions to the other invisible participants, the visible patients provided responses that demonstrated deep psychological insight and clinical understanding that exceeded their educational backgrounds or treatment experience. Realized that the invisible group members were serving as conduits for therapeutic wisdom that existed beyond my individual expertise. The visible patients were accessing collective knowledge about mental health recovery that they couldn't have developed independently, channeled through the perceived presence of supportive peers who represented different aspects of the healing process. The sessions became more effective than any group therapy I had previously conducted. Patients made remarkable progress, developed stronger coping skills, and formed therapeutic relationships that extended beyond our weekly meetings. The invisible participants provided continuity and support that I couldn't offer as a single professional, representing the voice of lived experience and peer wisdom. But the phenomenon began to affect my own perception. During sessions, I started to catch glimpses of the invisible participants in my peripheral vision, shadows that moved with human gestures, the suggestion of faces in the interplay of light and darkness around the circle. When I looked directly, the chairs appeared empty, but the sense of presence was undeniable. I found myself genuinely engaging with the invisible participants, asking them questions and listening for responses that came through the visible patients' translations. Margaret became my co-facilitator, Thomas provided the group's comic relief, and Ellen offered the perspective of someone who had learned to thrive despite mental illness. The final revelation came when I realized that the invisible participants represented aspects of therapeutic relationship that exist in the space between professional training, and human connection. They were the embodiment of hope, peer support, and recovered wisdom that every effective therapy group needs, but that individual therapists cannot fully provide. Margaret, Thomas, and Ellen weren't delusions. They were the collective therapeutic unconscious of everyone who had ever found healing through group process. The visible patients were accessing this archetypal wisdom through their shared perception, and I was serving as the facilitator of a therapeutic process that transcended individual psychology. When the visible patients eventually graduated from the group and moved on to less intensive treatment, the invisible participants remained. New patients who joined subsequent groups began describing the same supportive figures, accessing the same reservoir of therapeutic wisdom that had been established. Through collective therapeutic experience, the room itself had become a container for healing knowledge that persisted beyond individual participants. The circle of chairs maintained its therapeutic power even when I wasn't present, serving as a space where the accumulated wisdom of recovery could manifest through whatever medium was necessary. Visible or invisible, individual or collective. I continue to facilitate group sessions in room 204, but I understand now that I'm not the primary therapist. I'm a guardian of a therapeutic space that has developed its own consciousness, its own capacity for healing that draws upon the experiences of everyone who has ever found support and understanding within its circle of chairs. Some therapeutic relationships exist outside the boundaries of physical presence, and the most powerful healing often happens in the spaces between what we can see and what we can feel, where the collective wisdom of recovery takes whatever form is needed to provide hope, support, and the possibility of transformation. Pharmaceutical precision is not just a professional standard. It's a moral imperative when you're responsible for medications that affect the most vulnerable population in healthcare. As the night pharmacist for the psychiatric ward at Mercy General Hospital, I had developed systems of verification and double-checking that went beyond regulatory requirements. Every prescription was reviewed against patient files, contraindication databases, and dosage protocols before any medication left my pharmacy window. My workspace was organized with military precision, medications arranged alphabetically by generic name, dosage charts laminated and posted at eye level, and a logbook where I recorded every transaction. The night shift typically handled routine medication distribution and emergency prescriptions that couldn't wait for day shift approval. It was solitary work that suited my methodical personality and attention to detail. The anomalous prescription appeared on a Tuesday morning during my final hour of shift. The computer system showed a new order for a patient in room 314. Holloway, Richard, chlorpromazine 50 mg administered via injection, every 8 hours as needed for agitation. The prescription was signed by Dr. Marcus Thompson, with an electronic signature that appeared legitimate in the hospital system. What immediately caught my attention was the medication itself. Chlorpromazine in injectable form had been discontinued at our facility 3 years earlier, replaced by newer antipsychotics with fewer side effects and better patient outcomes. Our pharmacy hadn't stocked injectable chlorpromazine since the transition, and I was certain it wasn't available anywhere in the hospital. I checked the patient census for room 314, but found no record of any patient named Richard Holloway. The room was listed as vacant in the bed management system, scheduled for routine maintenance later that week. When I called the nurses' station to clarify the prescription, the night nurse, Patricia Wells, confirmed that 314 was empty and that she had no knowledge of any patient named Holloway. I flagged the prescription as an error and made a note in my log to follow up with Dr. Thompson during regular business hours. Electronic prescribing systems occasionally generated phantom orders due to software glitches or database synchronization problems. The protocol was to document the anomaly and pursue resolution through appropriate channels. But when I arrived for my next shift, the prescription had reappeared in my active queue, with a priority flag indicating urgent need. The electronic signature now showed Dr. Sarah Mitchell, another attending physician, and the medication request had been modified to include specific injection instructions and timing protocols that suggested familiarity with the patient's individual needs. I again verified that no patient named Richard Holloway was admitted to the hospital, and again found that room 314 remained vacant. But this time, when I accessed the prescription details, I found extensive notes about the patient's medical history, previous responses to antipsychotic medications, and specific contraindications that suggested a complex psychiatric case requiring careful medication management. The notes were clinically sophisticated and internally consistent, describing a patient with treatment-resistant schizophrenia who had been stabilized on chlorpromazine after failing to respond to newer medications. The detail was remarkable. Specific dates of previous admissions, family history of mental illness, and documentation of side effects that influenced current dosage recommendations. I spent considerable time researching chlorpromazine, reviewing medical literature about its use in treatment-resistant cases, and exploring whether there might be legitimate clinical reasons to resurrect this older medication for specific patients. What I found was that while newer antipsychotics were generally preferred, chlorpromazine remained an important option for patients who didn't respond to standard treatments. Despite the clinical rationale, I couldn't fill a prescription for a patient who didn't exist. I submitted a formal inquiry to the Medical Records Department, requesting verification of Richard Holloway's admission and treatment authorization. The response came back negative. No patient by that name had been admitted to the psychiatric ward in the past 6 months, but the prescription continued to appear in my system, now with additional urgency flags and notes from multiple physicians recommending immediate medication administration. Dr. Jennifer Adams had added notes about the patient's increasing agitation. Dr. Michael Foster documented concerns about potential violence if medication was delayed. Dr. Patricia Chen recommended around-the-clock monitoring until the patient was stabilized. The most disturbing aspect was that these physicians were describing a patient whose condition was deteriorating in real time, as if Richard Holloway existed somewhere in the hospital but outside the official documentation systems. Their notes showed the kind of detailed observation and professional concern that could only come from direct patient contact. I decided to investigate room 314 personally, thinking that perhaps there was a documentation error and a patient was actually housed there despite the electronic records. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor during my dinner break, intending to resolve the discrepancy through direct observation. Room 314 was indeed vacant, but it didn't feel empty. The bed was made with hospital corners, but the mattress showed the impression of recent occupancy. The nightstand contained a water glass that was half full, and the bathroom showed signs of use: a damp towel, toiletries arranged on the counter, and the lingering scent of institutional soap. More significantly, I found a medication chart hanging on the foot of the bed, documenting Richard Holloway's medication schedule and responses. The chart showed that chlorpromazine injections had been administered regularly for the past 2 weeks, with detailed notes about the patient's response to treatment. The handwriting matched the signatures on prescriptions I had been receiving. I photographed the medication chart and returned to my pharmacy to compare the documentation. The handwriting samples matched prescriptions in my files from the attending physicians, and the dates corresponded to the timeline of prescription requests I had been receiving. But according to all official records, these medications had never been dispensed from my pharmacy. The revelation came when I checked my medication inventory the next morning. Despite never filling the chlorpromazine prescriptions, my stock had decreased by exactly the amount that would have been used for Richard Holloway's treatment protocol. The injectable vials were missing from my locked medication cabinet, and my computer system showed no record of dispensing them. I conducted a complete inventory of all controlled substances, thinking there might have been a theft or diversion that was being covered up through falsified records. But only the chlorpromazine was missing, and only in quantities that matched the mysterious patient's prescribed dosages. Other medications remained at expected levels, with all transactions properly documented. The final piece of evidence appeared in my personal medication cabinet at home. I'd been experiencing increased anxiety about the situation and had been taking my prescribed anti-anxiety medication more frequently than usual. But when I opened the bottle, I found it half filled with chlorpromazine tablets instead of my usual prescription. The substitution was impossible. I had picked up my medication from a different pharmacy across town, and the pills had been my familiar anti-anxiety medication when I had taken one the previous evening. But now the bottle contained an archaic antipsychotic that I had never been prescribed, in dosage strength that matched the mysterious prescriptions I had been receiving. For Richard Holloway, I realized that Richard Holloway wasn't a patient in room 314. He was a patient in the Hospital's collective unconscious, a manifestation of all the treatment-resistant cases that had challenged the psychiatric staff over the years. The physicians writing prescriptions for him were accessing their accumulated professional knowledge about difficult cases, channeling their expertise through a fictional patient who represented the complexity and frustration of psychiatric treatment. The chlorpromazine that appeared in my medication cabinet was the hospital's way of helping me understand that I was also part of Richard Holloway's treatment team, that my role in the pharmaceutical care of psychiatric patients had connected me to the institutional memory of every difficult case that had required creative and persistent intervention. I continue to receive prescriptions for Richard Holloway, and I have learned to fill them despite his absence from official records. The medications disappear from my inventory and presumably find their way to patients who need them, channeled through a prescription system that operates beyond electronic documentation, but within the deeper logic of pharmaceutical care. Some patients exist in the space between official records and clinical necessity, and some prescriptions fulfill needs that transcend individual cases, serving the accumulated therapeutic wisdom that guides psychiatric treatment when standard protocols aren't sufficient. The chlorpromazine still appears in unexpected places: my desk drawer, my car's glove compartment, my jacket pocket. Reminders that pharmaceutical care extends beyond individual transactions to encompass the broader commitment to healing that connects every practitioner to the patients we serve. Organization was my sanctuary in the chaos of psychiatric intake work. For 3 years, I had processed admissions to Riverside Mental Health Center with methodical precision, ensuring that every form was complete, every signature verified, and every document filed in its proper sequence. The intake process was often the first impression patients had of our facility, and I took pride in making it as smooth and dignified as possible. My desk was arranged with surgical precision, intake forms in the top left drawer, sorted by admission date, verification documents in the center drawer, organized alphabetically, and completed files in the bottom drawer, ready for transfer to medical records. I had developed a rhythm that could process a new admission in under 20 minutes, from initial paperwork to bed assignment coordination. The problematic admission form appeared during the overnight shift on a Thursday in November. I had been covering for a colleague who was out sick, working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. rotation that typically handled emergency commitments and crisis admissions. The form was left on my desk with a note indicating it was a priority intake, requiring immediate processing. The patient's name was listed as Michael Harrison, a 34-year-old male requesting voluntary admission for treatment of depression and anxiety disorders. The form appeared standard, completed in blue ink with neat handwriting, all required fields filled in, emergency contact information provided. I processed it according to protocol, verifying insurance information and coordinating with the nursing staff for room assignment. After completing the intake procedures, I filed the Harrison form in my completed documents drawer and moved on to other administrative tasks. But when I opened the drawer an hour later to file another admission, the Harrison form was no longer there. Thinking I might have misfiled it, I searched through all my desk drawers but couldn't locate the document anywhere. I found it on my desk again, in the exact position where I had first discovered it, with the same note indicating priority processing. But the handwriting looked different, slightly more hurried, with subtle changes in letter formation that made it appear as if someone else had completed the form. The patient's age had also changed from 34 to 36, though the name remained Michael Harrison. I compared the form to my processing notes, thinking I might have made an error in the original documentation, but my notes clearly indicated a 34-year-old patient, and I had written down specific details that no longer matched the form in front of me. The emergency contact number had changed. The insurance information was different, and the admission date had shifted by 3 days. Assuming there had been a clerical error or that multiple admissions for different patients named Michael Harrison had been confused, I began the intake process again. I called the emergency contact number to verify the patient's information, but the person who answered had never heard of Michael Harrison and insisted that their number had never been associated with psychiatric hospital admissions. I filed the form again, making careful note of its exact location in my drawer. This time I placed it between 2 other documents with distinctive letterheads that would make it impossible to miss. When I checked 20 minutes later, the Harrison form was gone, but the documents I had used as markers remained in their original positions. The form reappeared on my desk for the third time, but now the patient's name had shifted slightly to Marcus Harrison, and the handwriting showed additional variations that made it appear to be the work of yet another person. The psychiatric history section now included references to previous hospitalizations that hadn't been mentioned in earlier versions, and the presenting symptoms had evolved from depression and anxiety to include persistent delusions about bureaucratic persecution. I documented each variation of the form, photographing the changes with my phone and maintaining detailed notes about the shifting information. What emerged was a pattern of continuous evolution. The form was rewriting itself, updating patient information in ways that suggested an ongoing narrative rather than static documentation. The most disturbing change occurred during my fourth encounter with the form. The patient's handwriting had become increasingly similar to my own, as if whoever was completing the document was learning to mimic my penmanship. By the time I examined the form the fifth time, entire sections appeared to be written in my handwriting, though I had no memory of completing them. The content had also become more sophisticated and psychologically complex. The patient history now included detailed descriptions of institutional paranoia and documentary delusions, clinical terms that suggested familiarity with psychiatric literature. The patient claimed to believe that his identity existed only within official forms and that his personality was shaped by whoever processed his paperwork. I began to suspect that a colleague was playing an elaborate prank, using their access to intake forms and knowledge of my work routines to create an impossible administrative situation. I set up a small camera focused on my desk, hoping to catch whoever was placing and removing the Harrison form during my brief absences. The camera revealed nothing unusual. No one approached my desk during the times when the form disappeared and reappeared. But reviewing the footage, I noticed something more disturbing. The form appeared to materialize and dematerialize on its own, fading in and out of visibility as if it existed in a state between documentation and void. The breakthrough came when I realized that my own handwriting was appearing on the form without my conscious participation. During periods when I was focused on other tasks, my hand would unconsciously complete sections of the Harrison intake form, adding details and observations that I didn't remember writing. I would find myself in the middle of documenting a complex psychiatric history for a patient I had never met. The form was teaching me about Michael Marcus Harrison through the process of repeatedly filling it out. Each iteration revealed new aspects of his psychological profile, his treatment history, and his evolving relationship with institutional systems. I was becoming his intake worker not through official assignment, but through compulsive repetition of the documentation process. The final version of the form that I encountered carried my name as the patient. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, documenting my own psychological history, my own reasons for seeking psychiatric treatment, my own descent into the bureaucratic maze that had consumed Michael Marcus Harrison. I had become the patient whose intake I had been processing, trapped in the same cycle of endless documentation. The form described my growing obsession with administrative accuracy, my increasing isolation from colleagues who didn't understand the importance of perfect paperwork, and my belief that institutional identity was more real than personal identity. It diagnosed me with bureaucratic displacement disorder, a condition that didn't exist in any psychiatric manual but described perfectly what I was experiencing. I understood then that the Harrison intake form was a trap designed to capture intake workers who became too invested in the documentation process, who lost themselves in the administrative machinery of psychiatric care. I had been processing my own admission through the medium of a fictional patient, documenting my transformation from staff member to patient through endlessly repeating paperwork. I filed the form one final time, placing it in the completed documents drawer where it belonged. But I knew it would reappear, carrying the name of the next intake worker who would become obsessed with perfect documentation, who would process their own psychological breakdown through the familiar ritual of administrative forms. The intake process continues, but I understand now that some admissions never end because they document the gradual absorption of staff members into the institutional systems they serve. The forms we fill out fill us in return, shaping our identities through the repetitive act of documentation until we become the cases we're processing. Some administrative work administers itself through the people who perform it, and the boundary between processing patients and becoming patients exists only in the space between one form and the next. Cleaning a psychiatric ward requires a particular kind of attention to detail that goes beyond maintaining sanitation standards. After 5 years working the night shift at Valley View Mental Health Facility, I had learned to read the spaces I cleaned, which rooms held tension that lingered after difficult days, which corridors absorbed the emotional weight of patient struggles, and which areas seemed to exhale relief when healing was taking place. My routine covered 4 floors of patient rooms, common areas, and administrative offices. I worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. when the building settled into its quieter rhythm and most patients were sleeping. The work was solitary but meaningful. I took pride in creating clean, dignified spaces that contributed to the therapeutic environment that helped people heal. Room 247 on the 2nd floor had always been different from the others. According to the facility maps, it was designated as a storage room, though it was never used for that purpose. The door remained unlocked, but the room stayed empty except for periodic deep cleaning that I performed as part of my regular maintenance schedule. What made it unusual was the complete absence of windows despite being located on the building's exterior wall. Every other room on the 2nd floor had at least one window, facing the parking lot or the small garden area behind the building. But room 247 was sealed completely, with no natural light source and no ventilation beyond the standard HVAC system that served the entire floor. Yet every time I entered the room to clean, it smelled of fresh air. Not the recycled institutional atmosphere that characterized the rest of the building, but the kind of clean, crisp air that comes from open spaces and natural circulation. I mentioned the anomaly to my supervisor, Janet Miller, thinking there might be a ventilation problem that required maintenance attention. She checked the building schematics and confirmed that room 247 was not connected to any special air handling systems. The fresh air smell was probably a psychological effect, she suggested, caused by the contrast between the sterile hospital environment and the room's emptiness. But the scent was too distinctive and consistent to be imaginary. It carried hints of grass and leaves, sometimes with the faint moisture that suggests recent rainfall. On certain nights, I could detect what seemed like ocean air, though Valley View was located 50 miles inland. The room somehow accessed outdoor atmospheres that couldn't exist within the sealed environment of a psychiatric facility. I began spending extra time in room 247, not just for cleaning, but to understand the source of the fresh air phenomenon. The room was perfectly square, approximately 12 feet by 12 feet, with the same institutional green walls and linoleum flooring used throughout the building. There were no visible vents, no gaps around the door frame, and no obvious source for external air circulation. But during my 4th week of focused observation, I noticed that the room's shadows behaved differently than they should given the artificial lighting. While the fluorescent fixtures provided even illumination that should have eliminated most shadows, room 247 maintained areas of darkness that seemed to have depth and movement independent of the light source. The shadows were subtle at first, slight variations in darkness that could be attributed to minor imperfections in the lighting system. But over time, they became more pronounced and purposeful, creating patterns that suggested the presence of objects or people that weren't physically present in the room. When I moved, the shadows moved as well, but not in ways that corresponded to my position or the fixed lighting above. The breakthrough came during a night when I was working alone in the building due to staff shortages. As I cleaned room 247, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that were shifting and reshaping themselves, as if responding to some activity I couldn't directly observe. When I looked directly at these areas, they appeared static, but my peripheral vision continued to detect motion and depth. I positioned myself in the doorway, where I could observe the entire room while maintaining some distance from whatever was creating the shadow activity. What I saw challenged my understanding of physical space and architectural possibility. The shadows weren't just moving. They were revealing glimpses of another version of the room, one that had windows, furniture, and occupants. Through the shifting patterns of light and darkness, I could see fragments of what appeared to be a patient room in active use. A hospital bed positioned near where a window should be with someone lying in it. a chair beside the bed where a visitor might sit, medical equipment that cast its own shadows, creating a layered effect that overlapped with the empty room I was standing in. The scent of fresh air intensified during these shadow revelations, and I realized that room 247 was somehow connected to an alternative version of itself, one that existed in the same physical space but accessed different atmospheric conditions, different purposes, and different occupants. The windowless room was showing me glimpses of the room it might have been, or perhaps had been, in some parallel version of the building. I began documenting these observations, taking photographs that showed the unusual shadow patterns and noting the times when the alternative room was most visible. What emerged was a schedule. The shadows were most active during traditional visiting hours, and the fresh air scent was strongest during times when patients in other rooms were receiving outdoor recreation or occupational therapy. The most significant revelation occurred when I recognized one of the shadow figures. During a particularly clear manifestation of the alternative room, I saw the silhouette of someone I recognized as Mrs. Dorothy Chen, a long-term patient who had been discharged 6 months earlier. She appeared to be sitting in the chair beside the bed, engaged in conversation with the figure lying there. Mrs. Chen had been one of my favorite patients to interact with during my cleaning rounds. She always thanked me for maintaining her room and often asked about my family and interests. Her discharge had been a positive outcome. She had stabilized enough to move to a supervised residential facility, but I had missed our brief conversations during my work routine. Seeing her shadow in room 247 suggested that the alternative version of the room was serving as a space where former patients could maintain connection to the facility that had been their home during treatment. The windowless room was providing windows into continuing relationships and ongoing care that transcended official discharge dates. I began greeting the shadow figures when I cleaned room 247, acknowledging their presence even though I couldn't interact with them directly. Mrs. Chen's silhouette would turn toward me when I spoke, and other shadows would shift position as if aware of my presence. The room became a meeting place between the version of the facility that existed in official reality and the version that existed in the emotional memory of former patients. The fresh air that filled room 247 was the breath of all the outdoor spaces that patients had missed during their hospitalization, memories of gardens, parks, beaches, and forests that provided psychological relief from institutional confinement. The room was offering access to the natural world that psychiatric patients often lose contact with during their treatment, serving as a therapeutic space that transcended physical architectural limitations. I continue to clean room 247 as part of my regular routine, but I understand now that I'm maintaining more than just a storage room. I'm caring for a space that serves as a portal between institutional care and the broader world that patients return to after treatment. The windowless room provides the windows that every psychiatric facility needs but rarely admits. Openings to hope, connection, and the ongoing relationships that support long-term recovery. The shadows continue their activities, and the fresh air continues to circulate, reminding me that healing spaces sometimes exist in the gaps between official reality and human need, and that the most important therapeutic environments are often the ones that don't appear on architectural plans but live in the spaces where institutional care meets the enduring human desire for connection and continuity. My grandfather's watch had been keeping in perfect time for as long as I could remember. The gold-plated Timex had belonged to Harold Bennett, who worked as a psychiatric orderly at the state hospital for 37 years before passing it down to me when I took a similar position at Millbrook Psychiatric Center. The watch ran approximately 3 minutes slow, requiring constant adjustment, but I wore it as a connection to family tradition and the generations of healthcare workers who had served before me. As a psychiatric orderly, my responsibilities included transporting patients, assisting with medical procedures, and maintaining security during challenging situations. The work required precise timing, medication schedules, appointment coordination, shift changes, all dependent on accurate temporal awareness. Despite its chronic inaccuracy, I had grown accustomed to compensating for my grandfather's watch, automatically adding 3 minutes to whatever time it displayed. The watch had developed additional quirks during my 18 months at Millbrook. Sometimes it would gain time instead of losing it. Occasionally, it would stop for several minutes before resuming its normal rhythm. and on rare occasions, it would run backward for brief periods before correcting itself. I attributed these irregularities to the watch's age and the electromagnetic interference from medical equipment throughout the hospital, but the pattern that emerged in Ward D was different from the random mechanical failures I had grown accustomed to. Every time I entered the ward, my grandfather's watch would stop completely, its second hand freezing in place until I left the area. The stops weren't gradual winding down motions typical of clockwork failure. They were immediate and absolute, as if time itself had been suspended within that particular section of the hospital. Ward D housed the facility's most challenging patients, individuals with severe psychotic disorders, violent tendencies, or acute psychiatric emergencies that required intensive monitoring and specialized care. The ward was secured with additional locks and surveillance equipment, and staff members needed special authorization to enter. My duties there involved transporting patients to and from treatment sessions, assisting with medical procedures that required restraint, and providing security backup during crisis interventions. The first time I noticed the watch stopping was during a routine patient transport. I had been assigned to escort Mrs. Patricia Holloway from her room to the Occupational Therapy Center, and as we passed through the Ward D entrance, my watch stopped at exactly 2:17. The second hand remained motionless throughout our journey down the corridor, resuming its movement only when we exited the ward 30 minutes later. Initially, I thought the timing was coincidental. Perhaps the electromagnetic fields from the ward's electronic security systems were interfering with the watch's mechanism. But the pattern repeated every time I entered Ward D, regardless of the time of day, the duration of my visit, or the specific activities I was performing there. The watch would stop upon entry and resume upon exit with mechanical consistency. What made the phenomenon more disturbing was the correlation between the watch stopping and patient disturbances in Ward D during my third week of observing the pattern. I noticed that the moment my watch stopped was often synchronized with a patient's scream, outburst, or medical emergency somewhere in the ward. The temporal suspension seemed to mark moments of acute psychological crisis. I began documenting these coincidences, noting the exact time my watch stopped and cross-referencing it with incident reports from Ward D. The correlation was remarkable. In 14 out of 16 documented instances, the moment of temporal suspension corresponded to a significant patient event, medication reactions, psychotic episodes, suicide attempts, or violent incidents that required immediate intervention. Mrs. Holloway, the patient I most frequently transported, began to notice my watch stopping during our trips through Ward D. She would comment on the quiet time when we passed through the corridor, describing a sense of suspension that matched what I was experiencing through my grandfather's watch. Other patients made similar observations, referring to certain areas of the ward as places where time doesn't work. Right. The breakthrough came when I realized that the watch wasn't simply stopping, it was marking moments when someone in Ward D was experiencing temporal distortion as a symptom of their psychiatric condition. Many patients with severe mental illness report disrupted time perception, feeling that minutes stretch into hours or that entire days pass in seconds. My grandfather's watch was somehow synchronized with these subjective temporal experiences. Dr. Michael Foster, the Ward D supervisor, confirmed that temporal distortion was a common symptom among the patients, particularly those experiencing acute psychotic episodes. They would lose track of time, become confused about the sequence of events, or feel trapped in repeating temporal loops that made linear time meaningless. The ward's treatment protocols included temporal reorientation therapy, designed to help patients reconnect with conventional time structures. I shared my observations about the watch stopping with Dr. Foster, framing it as a possible indicator of patient distress that might have therapeutic applications. He was intrigued by the correlation and asked me to maintain detailed logs of the temporal suspensions, including patient locations and behavioral observations that might help identify crisis situations before they escalated. What emerged from systematic documentation was that my grandfather's watch was serving as an early warning system for psychiatric emergencies. The temporal suspension would begin approximately 30 seconds before a patient's crisis became visible to staff, providing a brief window for intervention that could prevent more serious incidents. The watch was detecting psychological disturbances through temporal distortion before they manifested as behavioral symptoms. The most significant event occurred during a night shift. when my watch stopped at 11:43 p.m. as I entered Ward D for routine security rounds. The suspension lasted longer than usual, nearly 10 minutes, during which the entire ward felt unnaturally quiet and still. Patients who were normally restless or vocal became completely silent, and even the ambient sounds of HVAC systems and electronic equipment seemed muted. During this extended temporal suspension, I became aware that I was experiencing the same time distortion that affected the patients. Minutes felt like hours. My movements seemed sluggish, and the familiar corridor of Ward D appeared to stretch infinitely in both directions. I understood that I was temporarily sharing the psychological state of someone who was experiencing severe temporal displacement. When the watch resumed its movement, the silence was broken by a code blue emergency from room 412. Mr. James Patterson, a patient with treatment-resistant schizophrenia, had experienced a cardiac episode that required immediate resuscitation. The medical team later determined that his crisis had begun at approximately 11:43 p.m., the exact moment my watch had stopped. I realized that the extended temporal suspension had allowed me to experience Mr. Patterson's subjective time during his medical emergency. The watch hadn't just detected his distress, it had created a temporal bridge that allowed me to share his psychological experience and understand the profound disorientation that accompanies severe psychiatric symptoms. Following this incident, I began using my grandfather's watch as a therapeutic tool, paying attention to its temporal irregularities as indicators of patient need and opportunities for intervention. The watch became a bridge between staff understanding and patient experience, helping me provide more empathetic and effective care during crisis situations. Dr. Foster documented my observations in a research paper about temporal distortion in psychiatric patients, noting that environmental indicators of subjective time disruption might serve as valuable diagnostic and therapeutic tools. The watch became part of Ward D's informal assessment protocol, with staff members monitoring its behavior as an additional source of information about patient psychological states. My grandfather's watch continues to stop in Ward D, marking moments when time becomes fluid and psychological reality supersedes mechanical measurement. I've learned that some therapeutic relationships transcend conventional temporal boundaries, and that the most effective psychiatric care sometimes requires sharing the subjective time experience of those we serve. The watch now runs perfectly when I'm outside the hospital, keeping accurate time during my personal hours. But within Ward D, it continues to serve its true purpose, not measuring time, but marking moments when time becomes a therapeutic medium, when the mechanical precision of institutional schedules gives way to the human need for temporal understanding and connection. Some family heirlooms carry forward, not just personal history, but professional wisdom. And the tools that help us care for others often work in ways that transcend their original design, becoming instruments of empathy that bridge the gap between clinical observation and shared human experience. Medical rounds in a psychiatric facility follow established patterns that provide structure and predictability for both patients and staff. During my 12 years as an attending psychiatrist at Riverside Mental Health Center, I developed a systematic approach to daily patient visits that optimized treatment outcomes while maintaining the therapeutic relationships essential to psychiatric care. The routine was precisely timed, beginning at 8:30 a.m. and concluding by 11:15 a.m., covering 23 patients across 3 wards. The pattern of rounds had become as natural as breathing. I would begin with Mrs. Dorothy Chen in room 201, discussing her medication response and reviewing her progress with anxiety management techniques. Next was Mr. Robert Patterson in 203, who required careful monitoring of his bipolar medication levels and suicide risk assessment. The sequence continued methodically through each room, with conversations that followed therapeutic protocols while adapting to each patient's individual needs and current psychological state. What I initially dismissed as professional déjà vu began during the 3rd week of October. As I entered Mrs. Chen's room for our routine morning check-in, she greeted me with exactly the same words she had used the previous day. "Good morning, Dr. Morris. I had the strangest dream about flying over the hospital gardens." Her tone, inflection, and the specific details of her dream description were identical to our conversation from 24 hours earlier. Mr. Patterson repeated his response pattern as well, asking the same question about his medication dosage and expressing the same concerns about side effects using phrases that matched our previous discussion word for word. By the time I reached my 5th patient, I was experiencing a profound sense of repetition that extended beyond the normal similarities of routine medical interactions. The phenomenon continued throughout the morning, with each patient repeating conversations, behavioral patterns, and even physical gestures from the previous day's rounds. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell straightened her hospital gown in exactly the same manner. Mr. David Foster looked out his window at precisely the same moment, and Ms. Jennifer Adams asked about her discharge timeline using identical phrasing and vocal emphasis. I attributed the experience to fatigue and professional burnout. After 12 years of conducting similar rounds with many of the same long-term patients, it was reasonable that conversations might begin to feel repetitive. The human mind seeks patterns and can create false impressions of repetition when processing familiar information, under stress or exhaustion, but the following day brought an exact repetition of the previous day's pattern, which itself had repeated the day before. Not only were patients saying the same things, they were saying them at precisely the same times, with the same emotional affect, accompanied by identical environmental details. Mrs. Chen's dream about flying was described using the exact same words, and Mr. Patterson asked his medication question at 8:47 a.m., just as he had for the past 3 days. I began documenting these repetitions, maintaining detailed notes about conversation content, timing, and behavioral observations. What emerged was evidence of a temporal loop that encompassed my entire morning rounds routine. Every aspect of the 2-hour and 45-minute period was repeating with mechanical precision, from patient interactions to overhead announcements to the specific pattern of footsteps in the corridor outside each room. The repetition extended beyond patient behavior to include my own responses, reactions, and clinical decision-making. I found myself saying the same things to each patient, making identical notes in their charts, and experiencing the same thoughts and professional insights that I had experienced during previous iterations of the loop. My conscious awareness of the repetition existed alongside my compulsive participation in it. By the end of the first week of documented repetition, I realized that the loop was beginning to compress. What had initially been a 2-hour and 45-minute cycle was gradually shortening. The conversations were becoming more abbreviated. The pauses between patient visits were decreasing, and the overall duration of rounds was contracting while maintaining all the essential elements of the full routine. The compression effect was subtle at first, perhaps 5 minutes shorter on Monday, 10 minutes shorter on Tuesday, but the rate of contraction accelerated throughout the week. By Friday, my morning rounds were completing in 2 hours and 15 minutes, with all patient interactions compressed but still containing the same content, emotional tone, and therapeutic value as the original full-length version. I consulted with my colleague, Dr. Patricia Wells, about the temporal distortions I was experiencing, describing them as possible symptoms of stress-related perceptual changes or early signs of cognitive fatigue that might require medical evaluation. She recommended a psychological assessment and suggested that I might be experiencing dissociative episodes related to professional burnout, but the compression continued to accelerate. During the second week of the phenomenon, my rounds were completing in 90 minutes while still covering every patient interaction from the original sequence. Conversations that had taken 5 minutes were now completed in 3 minutes, but contained identical content delivered at accelerated pace with compressed intervals between exchanges. The patients seemed unaware of the temporal compression, responding to the accelerated interactions as if they were occurring at normal speed. Mrs. Chen would describe her flying dream with the same contemplative pace, though the clock on the wall showed that her narration was completing in half the original time. Mr. Patterson's medication questions were asked and answered with apparently normal conversational rhythm, despite occupying a compressed temporal framework. By the third week, the compression had reached a critical threshold. My morning rounds were completing in 45 minutes with patient interactions occurring at triple speed while maintaining their therapeutic content and emotional resonance. I began to suspect that I was experiencing the kind of temporal distortion that some of my patients reported during acute psychiatric episodes. The revelation came when I realized that the temporal compression wasn't a symptom of psychological distress, it was a therapeutic adaptation. The repetitive loop was allowing me to refine and optimize my patient interactions, gradually eliminating inefficiencies and focusing on the essential therapeutic elements that produced the best outcomes. Each iteration taught me something new about effective communication and clinical intervention. The accelerated timeline was enabling me to provide more intensive care within the same institutional time constraints. By compressing routine elements and focusing on therapeutically essential communications, I could offer more frequent check-ins, more detailed monitoring, and more responsive treatment adjustments than the standard once-daily rounds format allowed. The final phase of compression occurred during the 4th week, when my rounds were completing in 15 minutes while still encompassing every meaningful patient interaction from the original 2-hour and 45-minute sequence. The conversations had become pure therapeutic essence. No wasted words, no unnecessary delays. Just the concentrated core of healing communication delivered with maximum efficiency and impact. I understood then that the temporal loop had been a training program, teaching me to identify and deliver the most therapeutically valuable elements of patient care. The repetition had allowed me to perfect my approach, while the compression had shown me how to provide optimal care within realistic time constraints. The loop was breaking because its educational purpose had been fulfilled. When the repetitive cycle finally ended, I found that my approach to morning rounds had been permanently transformed. I could now complete high-quality patient interactions in a fraction of the time previously required, providing more intensive care while respecting both patient needs and institutional scheduling demands. The compressed rounds had taught me to focus on therapeutic essentials while eliminating the inefficiencies that had accumulated over years of routine practice. The phenomenon never repeated, but its effects persisted. My patient outcomes improved dramatically, satisfaction scores increased, and I was able to expand my caseload while maintaining the quality of individual therapeutic relationships. The temporal loop had been a form of professional development that transcended conventional training methods. Some learning experiences require repetition and compression to achieve mastery, and sometimes the most profound professional growth comes from discovering that time itself can be a therapeutic tool when we learn to use it with precision and intention. The rounds that repeated taught me that efficiency and empathy aren't opposing values, they're complementary aspects of effective psychiatric care that can be integrated through conscious practice and temporal awareness. My morning rounds now complete in 90 minutes, representing a balance between the therapeutic intensity of the compressed timeline and the relational depth that patients deserve. The loop taught me that every conversation with a patient is an opportunity for healing, and that the quality of therapeutic time matters more than its quantity when delivered with focused intention and clinical expertise. Hospital chaplaincy requires a delicate balance between spiritual comfort and clinical sensitivity, providing hope and meaning within an environment often marked by suffering and uncertainty. For 8 years, I had served as chaplain at Pine Ridge Psychiatric Hospital, offering weekly interfaith services that welcomed patients regardless of their religious background or current relationship with faith. The evening talks were voluntary, typically drawing between 12 and 20 patients who found solace in communal reflection and prayer. My approach was inclusive and non-sectarian, drawing from universal themes of healing, forgiveness, and resilience that transcended specific denominational boundaries. I prepared each week's message carefully, researching relevant passages, selecting readings that might resonate with patients facing mental health challenges, and crafting homilies that acknowledged both spiritual hope and psychological reality. The talks lasted approximately 30 minutes, followed by optional individual conversations for patients who wanted personal spiritual guidance. The chapel at Pine Ridge was a small, windowless room adjacent to the main recreation area, with folding chairs arranged in semicircles around a simple podium. The walls were decorated with symbols from various faith traditions: a cross, a Star of David, an Islamic crescent, a Buddhist Dharma wheel, representing the hospital's commitment to spiritual diversity. Soft lighting and acoustic dampening created an atmosphere of peace that contrasted with the clinical environment that dominated the rest of the facility. The anomalous evening occurred during the 2nd week of November, as I prepared to deliver a talk about gratitude and finding meaning in difficult circumstances. I had selected readings from various spiritual traditions that emphasized Thanksgiving as a pathway to psychological healing, and I had written notes that connected gratitude practices to the cognitive restructuring techniques used in psychiatric treatment. As I stood at the podium and looked out at the 19 patients who had gathered for the service, I opened my mouth to begin with my usual welcoming remarks. But instead of the English words I had prepared, what emerged was something else entirely. A stream of syllables in a language I didn't recognize, spoken with a fluency and confidence that seemed to come from somewhere outside my conscious control. The sounds were musical and flowing, with rhythmic patterns that suggested formal liturgical structure, despite being completely unfamiliar to me. The words felt ancient and significant, carrying emotional weight that transcended my inability to understand their literal meaning. As I continued speaking this unknown language, I felt a profound sense of rightness, as if I were finally delivering the message that these patients truly needed to hear. What was most remarkable was the patient's response. Instead of confusion or concern about their chaplain speaking incomprehensibly, they leaned forward with expressions of deep recognition and emotional engagement. Several began to weep, not from distress but from what appeared to be relief, as if they were finally hearing words they had been waiting to receive for years. Mrs. Elizabeth Foster, a long-term patient with treatment-resistant depression, had tears streaming down her face as she nodded along with the unfamiliar words. Mr. James Morrison, who typically remained detached during spiritual services, was visibly moved, his hands clasped tightly as if in fervent prayer. Throughout the room, patients showed signs of profound spiritual connection to a language none of us could identify. I continued speaking for the full 30 minutes of the scheduled service, delivering what felt like a complete sermon despite having no conscious understanding of what I was saying. The words flowed with natural rhythm and emphasis, including what seemed to be moments for congregation response, though I had no idea what responses were appropriate. The patients remained silent but deeply attentive, receiving the message with an intensity I had never witnessed during my English language services. When the strange sermon concluded, I felt a moment of disorientation as consciousness returned fully to my English-speaking self. The patients sat in reverent silence for several minutes before slowly dispersing, many approaching to thank me for finally speaking the old words or remembering the language we needed to hear. Their comments were cryptic but heartfelt, suggesting that the mysterious language had provided spiritual nourishment that my carefully prepared English sermons had been unable to offer. Over the following days, I researched the phenomenon extensively, consulting linguistic experts, theological scholars, and psychiatric professionals who might help explain what had occurred. The linguistic specialists confirmed that the sounds I could remember were not recognizable as any current or historical language in their databases. The theologians suggested it might have been glossolalia, speaking in tongues, though my experience didn't match typical descriptions of that spiritual phenomenon. More troubling was the fact that several patients approached me privately throughout the week, thanking me for continuing the old chaplain's tradition and expressing relief that someone was finally maintaining the real services again. When I asked what they meant, they would become vague and uncomfortable, insisting only that they had been waiting for someone to speak the words that worked, instead of the surface prayers that don't reach deep enough. I researched the hospital's chaplaincy history, looking for information about previous spiritual services and former chaplains who might have established traditions I was unconsciously continuing. What I discovered was that Pine Ridge had employed a chaplain named Father Thomas Brennan from 1978 to 1994, who had developed a reputation for providing extraordinarily effective spiritual care to psychiatric patients. According to archived records, Father Brennan had conducted weekly services that were noted for their unusual ability to provide comfort and healing to even the most resistant patients. His approach was described as linguistically innovative and spiritually archetypal, though the records didn't provide specific details about his methods. He had left the hospital abruptly in 1994, and no explanation was provided for his departure. The breakthrough came when I found Father Brennan's personal journal, donated to the hospital archives by his estate after his death in 2003. The journal described his gradual discovery that conventional religious language often failed to reach patients whose psychological conditions had altered their relationship with familiar concepts of spirituality and meaning. He had begun experimenting with what he called pre-linguistic prayer, spiritual communication, that bypassed cognitive interpretation and connected directly with deeper levels of human consciousness. According to his notes, Father Brennan had developed the ability to access what he termed archetypal spiritual language, a form of communication that existed before specific religious traditions had developed distinct vocabularies. This language could provide spiritual comfort to patients whose mental illness had disrupted their connection to conventional religious concepts, but who still yearned for transcendent meaning and divine connection. The journal indicated that Father Brennan's services had been remarkably effective, with patients showing significant improvement in mood behavior and overall psychological stability following attendance at his unconventional prayer services. But it also described his growing concern that he was losing his own linguistic identity, becoming so fluent in the archetypal language that he was beginning to forget how to communicate in English. His final journal entry, dated shortly before his departure from Pine Ridge, expressed fear that he was being absorbed into the language itself, and that continuing his work would result in complete loss of his individual consciousness to the collective spiritual need of the psychiatric patients he served. I understood then that my experience had been a continuation of Father Brennan's work, that something in the hospital's spiritual environment had preserved his approach and was channeling it through subsequent chaplains who were sensitive to the deeper spiritual needs of psychiatric patients. The unfamiliar language was indeed archetypal, a form of prayer that existed in the space between consciousness and the divine, accessible to those whose mental condition had broken down conventional barriers to transcendent experience. The following week, I prepared for the service by consciously opening myself to whatever form of spiritual communication was needed. Again, the archetypal language emerged, and again, the patients responded with profound recognition and gratitude. I realized that my role was not to understand the words I was speaking, but to serve as a conduit for the spiritual communication that these particular patients required. I continued to deliver services in both English and the mysterious language, depending on what emerges naturally during each gathering. The patients have taught me that some spiritual needs transcend conventional religious boundaries and require forms of communication that exist outside normal linguistic structures. The chapel at Pine Ridge has become a space where healing happens through words that carry meaning beyond comprehension, where prayer transcends language and touches the core of human spiritual experience. Some religious service serves needs that exist outside established traditions, and sometimes the most profound spiritual comfort comes from languages that speak directly to the soul without requiring cognitive translation.